and we recorded a record with him. But we had kind of lost our momentum, you know, everything that we had built up. It was 2 years later down the road, and we put out a single, and it didn't do much to radio. And then opportunities arose for, I immediately was offered the bass gig. It kind of looked like we were splitting up, you know. So I was offered a bass gig to go with this band, the Bottle Rockets, who are still great band. I love those guys from Missouri, Festus, Missouri. And I ended up going with them, and Audley ended up getting the gig with the Black Crowes. And Jason ended up moving down to Austin, Texas, and playing with Chris Duarte. So from there I went, played with the Bottle Rockets for another, I should say that Cry of Love, beginning to end, we were together for about 9 years, almost 10 years, from the very start to the end. And then I ended up playing with the Bottle Rockets for another 8 years, and playing with some other bands in between. I actually ended up moving down to Austin, Texas as well when the Bottle Rockets were on a break, and I ended up playing with Chris Duarte as well. So it was Jason and I and Chris Duarte. At that time, we were the Chris Duarte group or trio, and then I ended up playing with another guy named Jack Ingram, who I played with off and on for like 6 years, and that was great because that introduced me to a whole another music scene, a Texas music scene, which I had not had my eyes open to previously. A lot of great artists down there. So I did that circuit for a number of years, until finally in 2005, I kept getting a call from a buddy of mine who was a sound man, Sean Bacon, and he was out on the road with this artist named Chris Cagle. Chris Cagle was a huge Cry of Love fan, and he kept calling me, Seamus kept calling me. He's like, hey man, I think you ought to come up to Nashville and try out for this gig. My boss really loves you. And Chris would get on the phone like, yeah man, come up here, and you know, we need a bass player. And I would turn him down. He called me about, I guess maybe 3 times, you know, and I was like, no, I don't think so. So finally there was, this is in 2005, February of 2005, we had like a 2-week break with Jack. And Seamus called me up, he goes, man, we need a bass player, come up here. He goes, just come up here and try it. If you don't like it, you can always go back, you know. And I said, okay. So, and I should say this, every time that Chris Cagle called, he kept upping the money every time. I'd say no, and then he'd call back, you know, offer me more money. I was like, no. So finally I was like, all right, I'm going to try it, you know. So I came up and ended up getting the gig with Chris Cagle. That was in 2005, and that lasted for 2 years. I was with him for 2 years, and then Jack Ingram started coming up at that point nationally. You know, he was always big since I've known him in Texas, but then he started getting nationwide recognition. So then Jack called me, he's like, man, come on, you got to come back now because we're really rolling. And I said, okay. So then I ended up going back to play with Jack, but I still lived here in Nashville. And I should say this, that I will always be indebted to Chris Cagle because he's the reason I moved to Nashville. He's the reason I was able to buy a house in Nashville, and the reason I still live here today. So I ended up going back to play with Jack. Even though he was based in Texas, I just stayed here in Nashville. And I played with him for another 2 years. And then I got the call from Ricky Medlock, who called me, and actually I should say I had decided to part ways with Jack, and I had just started playing with Edwin McCain. Edwin had called me and said, man, you know, I'm looking for a bass player, and I knew Edwin over the years from going to Warren Haynes' Christmas Jam, you know, and I loved him and Kevin Kenny, great guys. And Edwin said, man, I need a bass player, and I had just started working with Edwin McCain. I'd only played with him maybe a week or two, and I got a call from Ricky Medlock, and Ricky goes, hey Robert, and I had a rapport with Ricky from back in Cry of Love because we had opened up a couple of shows with Blackfoot, and even as far back as Sidewinder, we had opened up a show for Blackfoot down in Myrtle Beach. And Ricky, he remembered me and called me up and said, hey, we're in desperate need of a bass player. This is when Ian Evans had, fallen ill at the time. And Billy Powell had just passed away. So they were auditioning keyboard players and bass players at the same time. Because Ian, God rest his soul, he had gotten to the point where he wasn't able to go out on the road. So I went to Blackbird Studio here in Nashville, and I was the first one in. I walk in and there's the bass rig, and then there's Gary Rossington. And I have to tell you, man, Leonard Skinner for me, that was growing up. I mean, the band I told you about earlier about being in high school with the kids, we were called the Southern Knights, and that's Southern Knights with a K, and it's not anything racial or anything. It's just we didn't know that at the time that Glenn Campbell song Southern Knights was out on the radio. So we were like, we play Southern rock music. 90% of our set list is Southern rock music. So, and we'll be Southern Knights with a K. So man, and 75% of our songs in that band were Skynyrd songs. We love Skynyrd and Marshall Tucker and Atlanta Rhythm Section, and on and on. And so anyway, when Ricky called me and I walked into Blackbird and there was Gary Rossington's rig set up right beside the bass rig, man, I was nervous and I was over the moon at the same time, excited, because I had to tell myself, I was trying to calm myself down, but I was like, man, even if I don't get this gig, I've made it here in this room to be able to play with these guys. So I did the audition, and I thought it went okay. I thought I played good, but I was the first one in, and as I was leaving, I saw several notable Nashville bass players, and I was like, oh man, I was like, I don't know, this is going to be, it's going to be tough. But I felt good about it, and I knew that I did as good a job as I could, because I had really studied up on those Leon bass parts. And Ricky told me, he goes, man, just play, all we want is someone to come in, learn the bass parts exactly like the record. And if you do that, he goes, you'll be fine. And that's what I did. And I must tell you, as much of those Skynyrd songs, that you've heard throughout your lifetime, until you sit down and really pick apart those Leon bass parts, they're really more involved than you think. Even Sweet Home Alabama. Now, I jammed Sweet Home Alabama, as we all have, probably hundreds of times in bar bands, but I had never sat down and picked it apart. And it's amazing. I mean, all of his bass parts, he was just a genius to me, Leon was. So that's what I did. I sat down and picked apart all of those bass lines. And so then they called me back, and they want me to come back and play while they were auditioning the keyboard players, which I did. So I was like, well, I was thinking like, well, this is going to be my second, audition. I'll go in. So I was just thinking I'll play a couple of songs and somebody else is going to come in. So I play, a couple of keyboard guys are trying out. And then I don't see anybody, there's no other bass players around. They keep calling in keyboard guys and I'm still there, I'm like, okay, this is going all right, So finally, we get to the end of the thing. We probably try out, I don't know, 7, 8, it could have been even 10 bass players. I don't know, because I was on cloud 9, just getting to play those songs over and over. So at the end, nobody has said anything to me, really, So they're talking about the keyboard guys, and so I was starving. So I go up. They had gotten some food up in the green room, and I went up there, and nobody said anything to me. And they're talking about which keyboard guys they like, and they decided on one guy, Peter Keys, who's still the keyboard player to this day. And then finally, Ricky says, he goes, hey Robert, and I was like, I look over and he goes, by the way, welcome to the family. And so that was when, I got the news that I was in Leonard Skinner. And that, I must tell you, it's still to this day a great honor to have played with those guys. And because all of those songs are just, you know, they're all in my fabric, in my DNA as a kid, as a musician growing up. You know, I grew up with that stuff, with those songs and those bass lines. And I must say, leaving that band was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. The decision to do that, and I simply, I'll run you down the story what happened. But I'd been playing with Skinner for 3 years, and we were on a break, and I was in a side band at the time with Peter Stroud, who's played guitar with Cheryl since, you know, the mid to late 90s. He's been there the whole time, off and on. She's had other, you know, bands come and go, but Peter's been steady, you know, the whole time. So she had just done this R&B record, which she had just finished up, and that was done. So she called Peter and said, hey, I need a, you know, she wanted to get a rock band back together. And Peter had gone to play with Sarah McLachlan, and the other fellas had gone to play with Noel Gallagher. And they were out on the road, you know, out of the country with Noel. So Cheryl Crow told Peter, she said, she goes, I need a rock band to go do this benefit in New Orleans. And he said, well, what about this band that I've been playing with? You know, side band is a band called Big Hat, and it's Peter, Audley Freed, Fred Eltringham on drums, and Keith Gaddis, who's a great singer-songwriter. He was our singer and guitar player as well. And myself and a guy named Ike Stubblefield, who's from Atlanta, a great keyboard guy, fusion, jazz, anything you want, rock, he can do it. Ike's incredible. So we had gone and recorded an EP down in Southern Tracks.